Going to Rushanara now, please.
Good afternoon. I've got some follow-up questions to Angela's and the chair's questions. Just on the fiscal sustainability report, I'll start with Professor Bean. Can you talk us through what the latest restrictions to activity, the winter economy plan, and a possible second wave, how those things might affect matters looking ahead?
Okay, well, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty here, and I should remind you of what Richard said at the outset. We're in the process of undertaking a forecast.
Sure.
The current juncture, so this is the sort of thing we're working on, but it would be inappropriate to give a running commentary. But I mean, in terms of how the economy has developed during the course of this year, I mean, initially there was relatively good news about the rebound from the lockdown, as the lockdown measures were unlocked, so that activity is something like 10%, a little bit less than that probably, below where it would otherwise be. You probably have Andrew Haldane before you saying that, you know, so far so V, and indeed it looked pretty much like our upside scenario up until the start of the autumn. High frequency indicators have flattened off a bit and suggesting the pace of recovery is slowing. But of course, the key thing is the resurgence in cases and the potential reimposition of lockdown measures on either a local or, worst case, national.
Sorry, Professor, if I could just interject. So, after so far so V, what does the shape look like? Where do you see it going if we're in second wave territory?
Well, I think it's reasonable to think that at a minimum, this is going to put the recovery on hold for a while.
Yeah. Right. For how long? How long do you see that?
Well, I mean, this depends on the course of the virus itself. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to make predictions there. It will depend upon, obviously, the non-pharmaceutical interventions that the government makes, the policy responses. And on top of that, it will also depend on how individuals, consumers and businesses respond. You certainly might expect that with heightened risks of catching the virus, consumers are going to be more wary about going to restaurants, bars, shops, even if they're open. So I think it is reasonable to suggest that there will be some hiatus in the recovery. Now, how long and how potentially deep that is, I think is very difficult to know at this stage until we see how effective any measures are in bringing the resurgence in cases back under control.
Sure. So this may be too simplistic a question, so forgive me, for both you and Richard Hughes. Do you think there's a case for more interaction, interdependence of thinking between what the OBR does and the health dynamics of all of this, given the deeply connected nature of this crisis and the knock-on effect on the economy and indebtedness and the rest of it? You rightly pointed out that you're not an expert on the medical side, but how much of that is going on in terms of the discussions as you look towards the November report? Because the public, our constituents, don't think about these issues in silos. They don't think about, they're not concerned about timings for reports. They want to know what's going to happen to their jobs, to the national debt level, public sector borrowing, and the taxation levels that they might face, how their businesses are gonna cope, and so on. So sorry to put it very simplistically in terms of the thinking out there, but that's what's going on. So could you elaborate on how your thinking is being shaped given the nature of this crisis?
Okay, well, I mean,
Richard, you, sorry, Professor, if you want to finish off, and then Richard.
Okay, well, I was just going to say, I mean, we obviously try to follow reasonably closely how the medical and scientific thinking is developing. I mean, going to the origin of your question, I mean, we're not intimately involved, so, you know, we're not a sage or anything like that. But of course, a lot of the scientific analysis is put into the public domain.
Yep.
I should say there is also a lot of work in the economic sphere by academics on this. It's a marked contrast from the financial crisis, the sort of explosion of work by economists analysing the impact of the pandemic. So we draw on that, and the analysis that's coming out of that informing our assessment. But of course, in terms of actually saying where things will go, you know, this is something one has to recognise the uncertainty. We can portray a range of likely outcomes, which is what we did in the summer with our FSR, with an upside and downside scenario. And I would want to continue to emphasise that we can't give people a firm say where this is going to go, but we might be able to say something useful about the range of possible outcomes.
Thank you. That's really, Richard Hughes, over to you.
Yes, and just to supplement that, I mean, you're right that the course of the virus is the crucial conditioning assumption for where the economy and public finances are going to go next, and that is why we continue to think of forecasting in terms of scenarios. And there is an upside scenario where there is the rapid development of an effective vaccine, which can be quickly rolled out to the population, which would return the economy more or less to its normal state ex ante, with very limited scarring on economic activity and things like long-term tax revenues and limited implications for sustainability. But there is also a downside scenario where that vaccine is not rapidly developed, where social distancing measures have to stay in place, where the kind of consequences for consumer behavior and business behavior last for the longer term. And that's reflected in our downside scenario, which we did in the FSR. And we're going to continue to think in those terms as we produce the EFO, so long as there is this level of uncertainty about the course of the virus itself and the government's public health restrictions, so that the public, so the government can test the resilience of their policy response against those different scenarios, because there is just so much uncertainty about the outlook. It is important to think about the resilience of policy to those different scenarios, and not just how policy is performing on a kind of central forecast of the sort that we've provided in the past.
Okay, thank you. I've got one question with two subsets, because I think this is my last one. So for all of you, so please come in as you please. So Professor Bean talked earlier about shocks, 2 shocks in the last decade, and building in risks in terms of planning for future shocks. Climate change is another major area of of risk, and potentially other forms of viruses. And I was really struck by an image in a magazine about the kind of many kinds of viruses that might be coming our way in the future. So there could be all sorts of shocks that come more regularly. What would you say is needed? What kind of thinking is needing, both within government and OBR and elsewhere, to prepare for those shocks and the cost implications of those, given that the COVID shock has been such a big surprise for all? I think everyone's been taken by surprise, whichever end of the political spectrum they might come from. And then in relation to businesses, corporate indebtedness as a result of the COVID crisis is rising and is likely to rise. Do you expect your analysis? Do you expect to analyse the impact of this in the public finances in the future for the FSR or the FR, the fiscal report, risk report going forward? And it would be great if Andy could come in as well.
Sure. Maybe I can just start off on your question about how to prepare for future shocks, and then maybe Andy could address the point about business debt. In terms of how to prepare for future shocks or how to anticipate them, there was some work done by the IMF a few years ago about where fiscal risks come from, where sources of shocks to the public finances come from, and they do find that they are quite varied, and it can depend on your neighbourhood, kind of what part of the world you're in. In some cases, it's natural disasters. In other cases, it's recessions. In the longer term, it could be very different things like climate change, as you say. What they found was that on average, a sort of typical recession added about 10% of GDP to a country's debt stock, and then a financial crisis added about 20% of GDP to a country's debt stock. Right. And recessions came along about once a decade, and financial crises came along about once every 20 years. And so those are the kind of shocks that governments need to anticipate when planning their longer-term debt to GDP ratio, and the scale of shocks that they can face from those two sources of what have been historical shocks to the public finances. Things like pandemic viruses, fortunately, don't seem to come along as frequently as recessions or financial crises, but based on our own forecasts, they are already adding 20% to the debt to GDP ratio. So all of these things argue for, again, it comes back to building in some resilience to your fiscal policy over the long term, aiming to have lower debt than you might otherwise have on a central forecast.
Okay, just one supplement to that. Do you think our government, and given your international perspective as well, do you think the world community is actually doing that adequately, and should we be looking to do more work on that?
I think the world is clearly becoming more conscious of the risks to the fiscal outlook. But I think also, what's benefited advanced governments all around the world has been the fact that actually their borrowing costs have been declining over time. So they haven't really felt the pain very much of their debt to GDP ratios going up, because actually the cost of that debt measured as a share of their total outlays has actually been going down. Whether that can be sustained going into the future comes back to a question about what's the long-term path of interest rates. But we have already seen a big benefit coming, and more fiscal space being given to governments to deal with shocks from the fact that the cost of their higher debt is actually lower. Whether that can be sustained into the longer run, maybe time is up, maybe not. A lot of people said time was up 10 years ago, and it wasn't. And governments bought a bit more time with even lower interest rates. But I think that is a big question, sort of confronting all economists at the moment.
And just on corporate indebtedness, Andy.
I think the general way we would think about the rise in corporate indebtedness is that it affects businesses' decisions. So you would expect on average for it to weigh on business investment, and that in turn weighs on productivity. I think the lesson of some economies after the financial crisis was that with very low interest rates as well, the cost of forbearance is low per borrower, but can be high for the economy by locking resources into place. So we don't know at this stage how much resources will need to move around the economy, but forbearance of those with high debts is one way of ensuring that they don't move. So it's all part of what will be a journey of discovery about how much scarring there is after this recession in terms of the economy's potential to grow. Post this crisis, of course, the government has guaranteed a very large proportion of new lending this year to companies. So there's a much more direct route from high indebtedness to the public finances if those guarantees are called.
Thank you. I think my time's up.